My stepsister said, "He was never really yours." She didn't know I'd already seen every message between them. She said it standing in my own kitchen, wine glass in hand, like she was stating a fact everyone else had already accepted. She told me my fiancé had never really belonged to me, that some things were simply meant to happen the way they happened. What she didn't know was that I'd read every single message between them 3 weeks earlier, and that by the time she said those words out loud, I'd already spent 21 days building something far more permanent than a broken engagement. My name is Cassandra Wren. Everyone calls me Cass. I'm 31 years old. I run a mid-sized event production company in Denver, Colorado, weddings, corporate galas, the occasional music festival, and I built it from nothing starting at 24, working out of a converted garage with 2 rented tents and a borrowed sound system. None of what I'm about to tell you happened quickly, and none of it happened the way I expected betrayal to happen when I used to imagine it, in the abstract, the way you imagine bad things happening to other people. I need to go back further than the kitchen, because the kitchen only makes sense once you understand the 12 years that came before it. My parents divorced when I was 17, not dramatically, just the slow, tired ending of 2 people who'd stopped being able to talk to each other years before they stopped living together. My father remarried 3 years later, when I was 20, to a woman named Dana Whitfield, who came with a daughter from her first marriage, Brooke, 2 years younger than me, 18 at the time, sharp-tongued, effortlessly pretty in the specific way that made rooms rearrange themselves around her without her seeming to try. I want to be fair to Brooke at least at the start, because fairness is the only thing that's ever protected me through any of this. For the first several years, Brooke and I were, if not close, at least cordial in the easy way step-siblings can be when neither one is required to love the other, only to coexist at holidays and the occasional family dinner. We weren't raised together as kids, we met as young adults, already fully formed people with our own friend groups and our own lives, and the relationship stayed at that comfortable, low-stakes distance for years. I liked her well enough. I never fully trusted her, but I couldn't have told you why back then, beyond a vague instinct I chalked up to not really knowing her. There's a small memory from those early years that I've turned over more than once since everything unraveled, trying to decide whether it was a warning sign I simply hadn't known how to read yet, or whether I'm only assigning it meaning now because I need my past self to have noticed something. When Brooke was 23, she dated a man named Theo for almost a year, someone I met a handful of times at family gatherings and genuinely liked. Steady, a little shy, clearly devoted to her in a way that seemed to embarrass her more than flatter her. The relationship ended abruptly, no clear explanation offered to the family beyond Brooke's vague comment that it just wasn't working anymore. Almost a year later, at a mutual friend's barbecue, I ran into Theo by accident, and in the kind of loose, unguarded conversation people have 3 drinks into a summer afternoon, he told me, without any particular bitterness, that Brooke had left him for one of his own closest friends, someone she'd apparently been seeing quietly for months before the breakup. I remember feeling a small jolt of unease hearing it, filing it away as an unfortunate but unremarkable story about a relationship that hadn't worked out, the way you file away most secondhand gossip about people you're not especially close to. I didn't think about Theo again for years. I think about him constantly now. My father and Dana's wedding itself was a warm, ordinary affair, a backyard ceremony, string lights, my father visibly happier than I'd seen him in years since the divorce. I gave a toast. I meant every word of it. Whatever came later, I want to be clear that I never resented Brooke's presence in our family, never treated her as an intruder, never harbored the kind of reflexive step-sibling suspicion some people carry into blended families out of habit rather than evidence. If anything, I spent those early years actively rooting for us to eventually become something closer than cordial, imagining a future where we'd be genuinely close, the sisters neither of us had grown up with. I met Elliot Marsh 5 years ago at a corporate gala my company produced for a tech firm's product launch. He was there as a guest of the client, not someone I would have normally crossed paths with professionally, and I remember noticing him because he was the only person in the room who seemed genuinely interested in how the event had been built rather than just enjoying it, asking questions about logistics, about how we'd sourced the lighting rig, the kind of curiosity that felt real instead of performed. We exchanged numbers that night, technically against my own rule about never dating clients or client-adjacent people, and I broke that rule and never once regretted it, not for 4 years. The early years with Elliot were honestly some of the best of my adult life. He was steady in a way that complemented my own tendency to overextend myself, always the one gently reminding me to eat dinner during a 16-hour event day, always the one who showed up early to help me load equipment even though it had nothing to do with him professionally. My parents both adored him separately in the specific way divorced parents sometimes compete quietly to claim credit for their children's good choices. Brooke, too, seemed genuinely fond of him from the beginning, warm at family dinners, quick to laugh at his jokes, the kind of easy rapport I'd once been grateful for, believing it meant my future husband and my stepsister would simply comfortably belong to the same family without friction. I understand now how naive that gratitude actually was. Elliot proposed 2 years ago on a trip to the Colorado mountains I'd planned as an ordinary weekend getaway, completely unaware he'd been carrying a ring in his jacket pocket the entire drive up. I said yes before he'd even finished the sentence. I remember thinking in that moment that I'd built 2 things in my life I was genuinely proud of without qualification, my company and this relationship, and that both had come from the same stubborn refusal to settle for less than what actually worked. The wedding was planned for the following October. 14 months of planning which, given my profession, I treated with the same obsessive precision I brought to every client event, except this time the client was my own life. Brooke was in the wedding party, my father's insistence more than mine honestly, though I didn't object. She'd become, by that point, more present in family gatherings, and Elliot got along with her easily, the same easy way he got along with almost everyone, which I'd always considered one of his best qualities. Looking back now, I understand that getting along easily and what actually developed between them were two very different things, and I spent months unable to tell the difference, because I had no reason yet to look for one. The first thing I noticed, roughly 10 months before the wedding, was small enough that I didn't register it as anything at the time. Elliot's phone, which had always sat face up on the kitchen counter, unremarkable, unguarded, started appearing face down more often. Not always. Not dramatically. Just often enough that if you'd asked me directly whether anything had changed, I would have said no and meant it, because the shift was too gradual to name. Then there were the late responses to my texts on Thursday evenings. Elliot had a standing Thursday night thing with a few college friends, poker mostly, sometimes just drinks, and for over a year I'd never thought twice about it. Around the same time the phone started flipping face down, my texts on those nights started taking longer to get answered, and when they did, the responses felt slightly generic, slightly delayed in a way that didn't match his usual quick, warm replies. I told myself it was wedding stress. Planning a wedding while running a company that produces other people's weddings is its own specific, layered exhaustion, and I gave both of us grace for being a little distracted, a little distant, assuming it would pass once the date arrived and the pressure lifted. The moment that actually stopped me, the first real crack, came 6 months before the wedding, at my father's 60th birthday dinner. It was a big family gathering, 20-some people at a restaurant my father loved, loud and warm and chaotic in the specific way big blended families are. I'd gone to the restroom mid-dinner, and on my way back through the hallway near the kitchen, I overheard Brooke's voice, low, unmistakable, talking to someone on the phone. I know, it's getting harder to pretend at these things, that's all I'm saying. I didn't hear who she was talking to, and I didn't hear enough context to know what pretend meant. I told myself, walking back to the table, that it could have meant almost anything. A work stress, a bad breakup she hadn't told the family about yet, 100 ordinary explanations that had nothing to do with me. But some part of me, the part that spent a decade producing events and learning to read the difference between genuine ease and careful performance in a room, filed that sentence away and didn't fully let it go. 3 weeks later, I noticed Elliot's laptop open on the kitchen table one evening while he was in the shower, still logged into his personal email. I want to be honest here, I wasn't looking for anything. I genuinely just needed to print a vendor contract, and his was the closer laptop. But sitting right there near the top of his inbox was an email from an address I didn't recognize, subject line blank, sender name just B. I didn't open it. I looked at it for perhaps 4 seconds, closed the laptop, and stood very still in the kitchen with a strange cold clarity settling into my chest, the specific feeling of a piece of a puzzle sliding into a shape you didn't want to see forming. I didn't confront him. Not yet. If you confront someone before you have the full picture, you don't get truth, you get a carefully rebuilt version of the truth, reinforced overnight into something harder to see through. So I watched and I waited, and I paid attention in the quiet, methodical way my career had trained into me without my ever intending it to apply to my own life. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes with watching someone closely while still sleeping beside them every night, still planning a wedding with them, still laughing at their jokes over dinner because the alternative, treating every ordinary moment as evidence, would have tipped him off before I had anything solid enough to act on. I got very good that spring at compartmentalizing in a way I'm not entirely proud of. I could sit across from Elliot at a vendor tasting, discussing cake flavors for a wedding I was privately starting to suspect might never happen, and give absolutely no indication that anything in me had shifted. I'd learned that skill professionally, managing difficult clients, keeping a calm face during a lighting rig failure 20 minutes before doors opened. I never imagined I'd need it for something this personal. 2 months before the wedding, I finally acted on the instinct instead of just sitting with it. I didn't hack anything, didn't do anything I couldn't defend later. I simply started noticing patterns more deliberately. Which nights Elliot's poker night ran unusually late. Which weekends Brooke suddenly had plans that overlapped, coincidentally, with weekends Elliot had told me he'd be out with friends. I built a small, private timeline in a notes app on my phone, dates and times, nothing more, the same instinct that made me track vendor deliveries and event timelines for a living now quietly turned on my own relationship. I remember one Thursday evening in particular sitting on my own back porch while Elliot was supposedly at poker, cross-referencing a string of his recent late nights against a family group chat Brooke was part of, where she'd mentioned, almost too casually, being tired from a long week on 3 separate occasions that lined up exactly with 3 of Elliot's late returns home. None of it on its own proved anything. All of it together was starting to form a shape I recognized but didn't yet want to name out loud, even to myself. The confirmation came from somewhere I never expected, Brooke's own laptop, left open and unlocked on my parents' dining table during a family visit, synced to the same cloud photo backup our whole blended family had set up years earlier for sharing holiday photos, a system none of us had ever bothered to fully separate after Brooke, and I stopped being close enough for it to feel invasive. I wasn't looking for anything. I was looking for a photo for my father's birthday to use in a slideshow I was putting together as a surprise for his anniversary. Instead, scrolling through a recently synced album, I found screenshots. Dozens of them. Message threads between Brooke and a contact saved simply as E, spanning back at least 8 months. I sat at that dining table for what felt like a very long time, scrolling with a hand that had gone strangely steady, the way your body sometimes goes still instead of shaking when something finally, fully lands. The messages started in the earliest screenshots as ordinary family logistics, planning details, a shared joke about a relative, nothing that would have raised a single flag on its own. By month 3, the tone had shifted into something else entirely, small comments that read as flirtation dressed up as friendliness, the kind of exchange you could still technically explain away if you needed to. By month 6, there was no ambiguity left in any of it. The messages referenced specific times, specific places, an intimacy of shorthand that only develops between two people who've spent real, private hours together. One thread, dated just over 2 months before I found it, contained a photo, not explicit, but unmistakably intimate in context, a shot of Brooke's hand resting on someone's chest, the fabric of the shirt visible enough for me to recognize immediately, because I'd bought that exact shirt for Elliot myself, for his birthday, less than a year earlier. I remember the specific, disorienting sensation of recognizing a gift I'd chosen with genuine care surfacing as evidence of the exact thing that gift now felt tainted by. I closed the laptop exactly as I'd found it, angled at the same slight tilt, screen dimmed the way it had been when I first sat down, and I sat there for another few minutes just breathing, listening to my father laughing at something in the other room, completely unaware that his living room and his dining room had just become two entirely different worlds. I didn't take my phone out and photograph the screen right there at the table, with my father in the next room. I memorized what I could, closed the laptop exactly as I'd found it, and left 20 minutes later with a reason that felt plausible enough, a client emergency, which in my line of work is always believable. I drove straight to my studio instead of home, sat in the parking lot in my car for almost an hour, and called my best friend, Priya Okafor, who I'd known since college and who has never once, in over a decade, told me what I wanted to hear instead of what was true. "How long have you known?" she asked, once I'd gotten the whole thing out. "Really known?" "About an hour." "Suspected?" "Months." There was a pause, the kind Priya uses when she's deciding exactly how bluntly to say the next thing. "Don't confront either of them yet," she finally said. "Not until you have more than a laptop you weren't supposed to be looking at. You need something you can actually hold on to if this gets messy, and Cass, it's going to get messy." What I hadn't told Priya yet, what I hadn't told anyone, was that seeing those screenshots had unlocked something in my memory I hadn't let myself examine closely before. The 61st birthday hallway conversation, Brooke's voice saying it's getting harder to pretend at these things. I understood now with a clarity that made my stomach drop all over again, that she hadn't been talking about a bad breakup or ordinary work stress. She'd been talking about Elliot. At my own father's birthday dinner, seated 12 feet from me, she'd been on the phone with the man I was planning to marry. Over the following 3 weeks, I did something I've never fully explained to anyone outside of Priya, because it required a version of patience I didn't know I had until I needed it. I didn't confront Elliot. I didn't confront Brooke. I kept planning the wedding, kept attending vendor meetings, kept sitting across from Elliot at dinner every night, saying nothing, watching him with an attention so careful he never once seemed to notice it had changed. What I did instead was build a record. I'm not proud of every part of how I did it, and I understand there are people who would say I crossed a line I didn't have the right to cross. I set up my own personal laptop, still logged into that same old shared family cloud backup neither Brooke nor I had ever bothered to disconnect, and over 3 weeks quietly I documented every new screenshot that synced into that album, new messages, new photos, a hotel receipt Brooke had apparently photographed for her own records and never deleted, dated 11 weeks earlier. For a property 40 minutes outside Denver, nowhere near either of our workplaces, nowhere either of us had any legitimate reason to be. I cross-referenced the hotel date against Elliot's calendar, which I still had shared access to from years of coordinating our schedules around client events. That day showed in his own handwriting, golf with Marcus out of pocket most of the day. I called Marcus, a mutual friend of ours, under the pretense of asking about a totally unrelated favor, and mentioned offhandedly that Elliot had told me they'd played golf that day. Marcus, without any idea what he was confirming, said he hadn't seen Elliot in almost a month. By the time I had 3 weeks of documentation, messages, the hotel receipt, the golf lie corroborated by an unwitting third party, I had something Priya's blunt honesty had insisted I needed, not suspicion but proof, organized cleanly enough that no one could later claim I was imagining things or building a narrative out of jealousy. I understood by then that whatever came next needed to happen on my terms, with my own timeline, not reactively, not in the heat of some accidental confrontation that would let either of them control how the story got told afterward. 6 weeks before the wedding, my mother, not my father's second family, my actual mother, who I'd stayed close to through the divorce and who had never fully warmed to the blended family arrangement, hosted a small engagement celebration at her house, a low-key gathering for close family before the wedding chaos took over completely. Brooke was there. Elliot was there. I brought my documentation with me, saved securely, not because I planned to use it that night, but because by that point I'd started carrying it everywhere, the way you carry something too important to risk leaving unattended. It happened in the kitchen, almost exactly the way I'd later describe it to Priya afterward, an ordinary lull in the evening, most people out on the back porch, just Brooke and me refilling drinks at the counter. She'd had enough wine by then to lose some of her usual careful composure, and she said it almost lightly, like she was making conversation rather than delivering a confession. "You know, Cass," she said, not quite looking at me, focused instead on pouring her glass, "I think some things are just meant to happen the way they happen. He was never really yours to begin with, not really. Some connections are just stronger than the paperwork around them. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because it wasn't what I expected. I'd spent 3 weeks preparing for this conversation to happen eventually, in some form, and I'd imagined feeling rage or grief or the urge to throw something. What I actually felt was a strange cold calm, the same calm I feel backstage at an event 40 minutes before doors open, when every possible variable has already been accounted for and there's nothing left to do but watch it unfold. I've already read everything, Brooke, I said, quietly enough that it didn't carry beyond the kitchen. Every message. The hotel receipt from 11 weeks ago. The golf lie he told me the same day, which Marcus, by the way, has no memory of. Her face did something I'd never seen it do before, a full, visible collapse of the composure she'd built her entire adult personality around, the same composure that had made rooms rearrange themselves around her for as long as I'd known her. You've known, she said, not a question, just a statement landing. For 3 weeks, I said. I wanted to make sure I had everything before I said anything to anyone. I wasn't going to let this become a story you two got to write the ending to. She didn't have anything to say to that. I set my glass down on the counter, walked out to the porch, and asked Elliot calmly if he could come inside for a moment. I didn't make a scene in front of my mother's guests, not because I was protecting him, but because I understood with the same instinct that's built my entire career, that the version of this conversation that mattered wasn't the public one. It was the one where I controlled every piece of information, and he didn't get to spin a single detail before I'd already laid it all out. I ended the engagement that night in my mother's guest bedroom quietly, without an audience, showing him exactly what I had, the screenshots, the receipt, the calendar entry, Marcus's confirmation. He didn't deny it once he saw the scope of what I'd assembled. He tried, briefly, to frame it as something that just happened, the way people always try to frame these things as whether rather than choice, and I told him, in the same level voice I use when a vendor tries to explain away a broken contract, that 8 months of messages and a planned hotel stay don't happen. They're built deliberately the same way I'd built the case documenting it. I want to tell you the story ends there, with a broken engagement and a clean exit, but the next 6 weeks were harder than that, because a wedding 14 months in the making doesn't simply stop existing the moment the reason for it disappears. I had contracts to cancel, my own contracts with vendors I worked with professionally, which meant dissolving my own wedding required a level of careful, humiliating precision I wouldn't have wished on anyone. I had 200 guests to notify. I had a venue deposit, a dress, a cake tasting scheduled for the following week that I had to call and cancel myself, my voice steady on the phone in a way that cost me more than anyone on the other end of that call could have known. The dress was the hardest part, honestly, harder than I expected anything to be after everything else I'd already survived. I'd had it altered twice, small adjustments to the waist and hem, and I remember standing in the boutique fitting room the week before everything fell apart, looking at myself in that mirror, genuinely happy, with no idea that the version of my life I was picturing had already been quietly hollowed out for months. When I called to cancel the final fitting, the seamstress who'd worked with me through both alterations and clearly liked me, asked gently if everything was all right. I told her simply that the wedding wasn't happening anymore, and she went quiet for a moment before saying she was sorry, in a voice that suggested she understood, without my having to explain further, that something had gone wrong beyond simple cold feet. I drove to the venue myself to formally cancel in person rather than over email, partly out of professional courtesy. I worked with these vendors regularly, and I didn't want a canceled personal wedding to become an awkward footnote in a business relationship I needed to preserve. The venue coordinator, a woman named Sophia I'd known for years through my own work producing events there, hugged me in the parking lot afterward, unprompted, and told me she'd wondered months earlier whether something felt slightly off during one of our planning meetings, though she hadn't wanted to say anything at the time. I asked her what she'd noticed. She said it wasn't anything specific, just that Elliot had seemed distracted in a way that didn't match how attentive he'd been at our first meeting, over a year earlier. I remember standing in that parking lot thinking about how many people, at the edges of my life, had apparently absorbed small warning signs I hadn't yet let myself see clearly, each of us holding a fragment of the same picture, none of us assembling it until it was already too late to matter. What made it bearable in the weeks that followed wasn't revenge exactly. It was something quieter and in its own way more useful. My father, once he learned the full story, which I told him myself calmly, with the same documentation I'd shown Elliot, because I refused to let this become a rumor he heard secondhand through Dana's version of events, was devastated in a way that surprised me with its depth. He'd brought Brooke into our family with real hope that it could become something whole, and watching that hope collapse under the weight of what she'd actually done clearly cost him something significant. Dana, to her credit, didn't try to defend her daughter once the full picture was laid out. She and my father separated 4 months later, not solely because of what Brooke had done, but because the discovery seemed to crack open a set of older, unaddressed cracks in their marriage that had been quietly widening for years, the way one honest reckoning sometimes forces a family to stop avoiding several others at once. I don't take satisfaction in that part. I never wanted my father's marriage to end. But I also understand now that a family built partly on people's willingness to look away from uncomfortable things eventually runs out of places left to look. I didn't publicly expose any of it, not in the dramatic way some of these stories go, no confrontation at a public event, no scene at a wedding that wasn't happening anymore. What I did instead was quieter and in its own way more permanent. I sent the full documentation, messages, receipt, calendar records, everything Priya had insisted I build carefully enough to be undeniable, to my mother, to my father, and to the small handful of mutual friends, including Marcus, who deserved to understand honestly why the wedding they'd been planning to attend had simply stopped existing. I didn't editorialize. I didn't need to. The documentation spoke clearly enough on its own, the same way clean evidence always does once it's finally allowed into a room instead of being kept in a locked laptop for years. Elliot's own social circle, once the reason for the broken engagement became clear, distanced from him in the specific, quiet way people distance from someone who's revealed something ugly about their character rather than something merely unfortunate about their circumstances. Marcus, in particular, never spoke to him again, something Elliot apparently found more painful, in the months that followed, than losing me, a detail I only learned secondhand months later, and that told me more about the shape of him than anything else could have. Brooke moved to Phoenix 8 months later, ostensibly for a job opportunity, though I understood, and I think she understood too, that Denver had simply become too small a city for the version of herself the truth had left behind. We haven't spoken since the night in my mother's kitchen. I don't know if we ever will, and I've made a kind of peace with that particular silence, the same way you make peace with a structural wall you've decided not to rebuild because what it was holding up wasn't worth the wait anymore. I want to be honest about the part of this that doesn't resolve as neatly as a courtroom verdict or a clean confrontation scene, because that's the part that actually took the longest to heal. For months after the engagement ended, I didn't trust my own judgment the way I had before. I'd built a company on trusting my instincts about people, which vendors would deliver, which partnerships would hold, which clients were being honest about their budgets, and for a long time after Elliot, I second-guessed every read I had on every person in my life, wondering what else I might be missing, what other quiet betrayal might be sitting one laptop screen away from discovery. Priya was the one who eventually talked me through the difference between the instinct that failed me and the instinct that ultimately saved me. You didn't miss it because your judgment is broken, she told me, one night almost a year later, over a bottle of wine on my back porch. You missed it at first because you loved him, and love is supposed to make you generous with your doubts. But the second you actually let yourself look, really look, you built an entire case in 3 weeks. That's not broken judgment, Cass. That's judgment that just needed permission to trust itself. I think about that a lot now, almost 2 years removed from the kitchen conversation that ended everything. I run my company differently these days, not more suspiciously exactly, but with a kind of clear-eyed attention I didn't fully have before, the understanding that the people closest to you are exactly the ones capable of building something quiet and devastating right under your nose, precisely because you've given them the access and the benefit of the doubt that makes it possible. I got engaged again last spring to a man named Julian Ferreira, a structural architect I met, fittingly, at a venue site visit for someone else's wedding. Our relationship has been slower, more deliberate, built with an honesty I insisted on from the very beginning, partly because I understand now, in a way I didn't before, that trust isn't something you simply extend and hope holds. It's something you build carefully, watch closely, and if you ever need to, you document the truth of, clearly enough that no one gets to rewrite it later except you. Julian knows the whole story, all of it, in more detail than almost anyone else in my life besides Priya. I told him early on our 4th date, over a quiet dinner where I'd more or less decided that if this was going to become something real, it needed to start with the truth rather than a curated version of my history. He listened the way Priya always had, without flinching, without offering easy comfort I hadn't asked for, just steady attention until I'd said everything I needed to say. When I finished, he asked me one question that has stayed with me since. Do you think you'll ever fully trust again, or is this always going to be something you manage instead of something that heals? I didn't have a clean answer for him that night. I still don't entirely. What I told him was that I didn't think trust would ever again be the unconsidered, automatic thing it was before Elliot, but that I'd rather have a clear-eyed, deliberately chosen trust than the comfortable blindness I'd mistaken for it in my 20s. My father and I talk more often now than we did before any of this happened, an unexpected consequence of a genuinely painful year. Watching his second marriage end forced a kind of honesty between us that hadn't existed since before his first divorce, when I was still young enough to believe adults always knew what they were doing. He apologized to me once, unprompted, for not seeing what was happening under his own roof, the same kind of apology I imagine gets repeated in different forms across every family that's ever had to reckon with a betrayal they didn't catch in time. I told him what I've come to believe is actually true, that the people closest to a deception are often the least equipped to see it clearly, precisely because seeing it requires suspecting someone you have every emotional reason not to suspect. He didn't fail to notice because he wasn't paying attention. He failed to notice because paying the kind of attention that would have caught it meant doubting people he loved, and love, by its nature, resists that kind of vigilance until it's forced to. I think about Theo sometimes, Brooke's old boyfriend from years before any of this, the one who told me at a barbecue, without bitterness, that she'd left him for one of his own closest friends. I wonder now whether he ever fully understood the pattern he'd lived through, or whether, like me for so many years, he simply filed it away as an unfortunate ending rather than a warning. I don't know if I'll ever reach out to him. Some part of me wants to, just to tell him I finally understand what he was describing that afternoon, years too late to have done either of us any good. Another part of me thinks that letting it stay in the past, fully closed, is its own kind of mercy for both of us. My company had its best year yet, the year after the engagement ended, which surprised me until I understood why. I'd spent 14 months planning a wedding with the same obsessive precision I brought to client events, and when that precision was suddenly freed up, redirected entirely back into my actual work, the results showed almost immediately. There's a particular kind of clarity that comes from having already survived the worst version of betrayal you can imagine happening in your own kitchen. Client problems, vendor disasters, difficult negotiations, none of it carries quite the same weight anymore, once you've already sat across from someone you loved and watched them fail to deny what you already knew. Brooke was never really the one who took anything from me in the end, whatever she believed that night in the kitchen. She thought she was claiming something that had somehow always belonged to her. What she never understood, standing there with her wine glass and her careful, rehearsed line about paperwork and connection, was that I'd already built the entire truth around her, 3 weeks before she ever said a single word of it out loud.